"You were never supposed to come back for anything," my mother said, her voice calm in a way that didn't match the finality of what she was doing. And then I heard the deadbolt slide into place while I was still standing on the front step, holding nothing but a half-zipped duffel bag and the quiet realization that this had been planned long before tonight. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't knock, I didn't beg, because something in the way she said it told me this wasn't an argument I could win. It was a decision that had already been made without me, and for a moment I just stood there in the cold, staring at a door I had unlocked 1,000 times growing up, trying to understand how a place that used to feel like home could close so completely in a single second. "Mom," I said, not loudly, just enough for her to hear through the wood, "if this is really what you want, then I'll respect it," and there was a pause on the other side, just long enough to make me think she might answer. But she didn't, and that silence said more than anything else could have. The porch light flickered once above me, casting a pale glow over the driveway, and I noticed details I had never paid attention to before, like the way the paint on the railing had started to peel, or how quiet the neighborhood felt when you realized you no longer belonged to it, and that was when the weight of it settled in, not as panic, not as anger, but as something colder, something clearer. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and stepped off the porch without looking back again, because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't allowed myself to fully see before. This wasn't just about tonight, it was about years of small dismissals, quiet exclusions, and conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. It was about being tolerated when I was useful and overlooked when I wasn't, and tonight was simply the first time they had decided to make it official. I walked down the driveway slowly, my shoes crunching against the gravel, and I could feel the tension building in my chest, not as a burst of emotion, but as pressure that had been collecting for a long time, finally given somewhere to go, and I kept my expression neutral even though no one was there to see it, because that's who I had learned to be in that house, composed, careful, measured, never giving them a reaction they could use against me. As I reached the sidewalk, I took one last look at the house, not out of longing, but out of clarity, and I said quietly, more to myself than anyone else, "I understand." Because I did, I understood exactly what they were telling me. Without saying it outright, that I was no longer part of their plans, that whatever they were protecting or rearranging inside that house no longer included me, and once that truth settled, the hesitation disappeared. I didn't know where I was going to sleep that night, I didn't know how long it would take to rebuild, and I didn't know what they thought would happen after I was gone, but I did know one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to turn around and ask to be let back in, not now, not later, not ever, because if someone can close a door on you that easily, then walking back through it is never really your decision. I reached the end of the block and stopped for a second, pulling my phone out of my pocket, the screen lighting up in my hand as I considered whether to call anyone, but then I slipped it back without unlocking it, because this was something I needed to face without leaning on the same patterns that had kept me in that house for so long. And as I started walking again, I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet, but distance, the kind that doesn't come from miles, but from understanding exactly where you stand in someone else's life. And as the house disappeared behind me, I realized something that would change everything that came after. I hadn't been thrown out in a moment of anger, I had been removed with intention. And people don't do that unless they believe you're in the way of something they're trying to protect, and that was when the question stopped being "why did she do this?" and became something much more important, something I would carry with me for the next 3 weeks. What exactly did they think they were gaining by losing me? I walked for nearly 20 minutes before I allowed myself to stop, not because I had a destination in mind, but because standing still for too long felt like admitting I had nowhere to go, and I was not ready to give that truth a voice yet. The night air had turned colder than I expected, the kind that settles into your hands first, then your shoulders, until you realize you have been holding tension in your body for longer than you should, and I adjusted my grip on the duffel bag, shifting its weight like it might somehow make the situation feel more manageable. I found a bench near a closed convenience store, the fluorescent lights inside still humming even though the doors were locked, and I sat down carefully, placing the bag beside me as if it contained something fragile, even though there was nothing in it that mattered enough to break. For a few seconds, I simply listened, to the distant sound of cars passing, to the faint buzz of electricity from the building behind me, to my own breathing slowing into something steady and controlled, because if there was one thing I refused to do, it was let this moment turn into panic. I pulled my phone out again and checked the time, just after 10, and for a brief second, I considered calling my mother, not to argue, not to ask to come back, but to give her a chance to clarify, to say that maybe this had been said in frustration, that maybe there was still room for something to be resolved, but I stopped myself before I even unlocked the screen, because deep down I already knew the answer, and asking for it would not change anything except how I felt about myself afterward. Instead, I opened my notes app and began listing what I actually had, not emotionally, but practically, because fear becomes smaller when you reduce it to numbers and options. I had $43 in my wallet, a charger, 2 changes of clothes, and an identification card, and that was enough to start making decisions. I stood up again and began walking, this time with purpose, heading toward the one place that made sense without requiring explanation, the small print and shipping center I had worked at part-time during college. It was not guaranteed they would need help, and it was not even open at that hour, but it was familiar, and familiarity mattered when everything else had been taken away without warning. As I walked, I replayed the last few weeks in my mind, not emotionally, but analytically, looking for patterns I had ignored, the quiet conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the way certain documents had been left on the kitchen counter just long enough for me to notice before they disappeared again, the tension in my mother's tone whenever finances came up, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that tonight had not been sudden, it had been the conclusion of something that had been building for a while, something I had been too willing to overlook because acknowledging it would have required me to confront the possibility that I was no longer seen as part of that household's future. You should have seen it, I said quietly to myself as I crossed the empty street, not with regret, but with acceptance, because missing the signs does not make them less real, it just delays the moment you have to respond to them. By the time I reached the strip of small businesses where the print shop was located, the lights were off and the parking lot was empty, but I stopped anyway, standing there for a moment as if the building itself might offer some kind of answer, and then I nodded once, a small, controlled gesture, and said, tomorrow, because that was how this would work now, not all at once, not solved in a single night, but step by step, decision by decision. I found a nearby 24-hour diner a few blocks away, the kind with faded booths and a menu that had not changed in years, and I stepped inside, the warmth hitting me immediately as the door closed behind me, and a waitress looked up from behind the counter, her expression neutral but not unkind, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to speak to someone without filtering every word through years of family expectation. Can I just sit for a while? I asked, my voice steady. I will order something in a minute, and she nodded without hesitation, sliding a glass of water toward me before I even sat down, and that small, simple gesture, something so ordinary most people would not notice it, felt more grounding than anything that had happened in my own house that evening. I sat there with my hands wrapped loosely around the glass, letting the condensation cool my palms, and I made a quiet decision that would shape everything that followed. I was not going to spend the next few days trying to understand why I had been pushed out. I was going to focus on what came next, because whatever they thought they had solved by removing me, they were about to learn something they had underestimated. I had never been dependent on their approval as much as they believed, and now that I had nothing left to protect in that house, I had something far more valuable, clarity, and with that clarity came a kind of calm that did not look dramatic from the outside, but would change the direction of this entire story in ways they were not prepared for. The waitress did not ask questions, and I appreciated that more than anything she could have said, because questions would have required explanations, and explanations would have forced me to turn something I had already accepted into something I had to justify. I ordered a coffee and something simple I knew I could stretch over time, and as I sat there watching the slow rhythm of the diner, I began to shift from reacting to planning, because the moment you stop asking why and start asking what next, everything changes. By midnight, I had already mapped out the next 48 hours in my head, not perfectly, but enough to move forward without hesitation, and when the waitress came back to refill my coffee, she glanced at the duffel bag at my feet and then back at me with a quiet understanding that did not feel intrusive, and she said, "You can stay as long as you need, just let me know if you want more," and I nodded once, meeting her eyes. "Thank you, I appreciate that," because gratitude, even in small moments, felt like something I needed to hold on to. I did not sleep much that night, not because I could not, but because my mind refused to slow down, not in panic, but in calculation, reviewing every resource, every possibility, every connection that did not depend on the family I had just walked away from, and by the time the sky outside the diner windows began to lighten, I had already decided my first move. I stepped outside just after 6 in the morning, the air sharper now, cleaner, and I adjusted my jacket as I began walking back toward the strip where the print shop was located, the streets gradually filling with early commuters who had no idea how much a single night could change the direction of someone's life, and I kept my pace steady, blending into that routine without drawing attention, because invisibility, in that moment, was an advantage. When I reached the shop, the lights were still off, but I did not hesitate. I sat on the low concrete edge near the entrance and waited, not checking my phone, not second-guessing the decision, just waiting. Because sometimes showing up before the door opens says more than anything you could explain later. At exactly 7:20, a car pulled into the lot, and I recognized it immediately, the same older model sedan that had been there years ago, and when the driver stepped out, he paused for a second when he saw me, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition. "Tige," he said, his voice carrying that same steady tone I remembered, and I stood up, brushing my hands lightly against my jeans. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," I replied, keeping my voice calm and respectful, because no matter the situation, how you present yourself determines how people respond. He looked at the bag, then back at me, not with judgment, but with a quiet assessment. "You are here early," he said, unlocking the door, and I gave a small nod. "I was hoping you might have any work available, even temporary." "I am available immediately," I said, choosing my words carefully, direct but not desperate, and he held the door open for me as he considered that for a moment before answering. "We always need people who show up when they say they will," and that was all he said, but it was enough. Inside, the familiar smell of paper, ink, and cardboard grounded me in a way I had not expected, and as I set my bag down in the corner he pointed to, I felt something settle into place, not comfort, not yet, but direction. He walked me through what needed to be done that morning, nothing complicated, just sorting, labeling, organizing shipments, the kind of work that rewards focus and consistency, and I listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, asking only what was necessary, because the goal was not to impress, it was to establish reliability. By mid-morning, I was already moving through the tasks without hesitation, my hand steady, my mind clear, and for the first time since the door had closed behind me the night before, I felt a sense of control return, not over everything, but over enough to keep moving forward. During a short break, Mr. Callahan stepped into the back area where I was organizing a set of packages, and he leaned against the doorframe for a moment before speaking. "You did not come here by accident," he said, not as a question, and I paused briefly before answering. "No, sir, I did not," keeping my tone even, and he nodded once, as if that confirmed something for him. "There is a room above my sister's garage," he said after a moment. "She rents it out sometimes, short term, nothing fancy, but it is clean and quiet. I can make a call if you need it," and I held his gaze for a second, measuring the weight of what he was offering, before responding. "I would be very grateful for that opportunity," and he gave a short nod, already reaching for his phone, because in moments like this, the difference between staying stuck and moving forward often comes down to whether you recognize the door that is quietly being opened for you. As I returned to my work, I understood something with complete clarity. I had walked away from a house that no longer had a place for me, but in less than 12 hours, I had already begun building something that did not depend on their approval. And while they may have believed removing me would simplify their situation, they had overlooked one critical detail. I was not the problem they thought I was, and sooner or later, they were going to realize exactly what they had lost. By late afternoon, the rhythm of the work had settled into something steady, almost predictable, and that predictability gave me space to think in a way I had not allowed myself to the night before, not about what I had lost, but about what had been happening long before I walked out that door. When Mr. Callahan returned from his call, he did not make it a dramatic moment. He simply placed a small slip of paper on the table beside me with an address written in neat handwriting and said, "She will be expecting you this evening, just let her know I sent you," and I looked at the address for a second before responding. "Thank you, I will take care of it," because I understood that what he had just given me was more than a place to stay, it was time, and time is the one thing people underestimate when they believe they have already removed you from the equation. The room above the garage was exactly as he described, small, clean, quiet, with a narrow window that faced an alley lined with older trees, and when his sister opened the door, she studied me for a moment. In the same way he had, not suspicious, just observant, and I said, "Good evening, my name is Tige Monroe. Mr. Callahan mentioned you might have a room available," keeping my posture straight, my tone respectful, because first impressions matter more when you have nothing else to rely on, and she nodded once, stepping aside to let me in. "You can stay for now, we will discuss details later," and that was enough. That night, as I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, I finally allowed myself to go through everything I had been avoiding, not emotionally, but methodically, piece by piece, because distance changes how clearly you see patterns, and what I had dismissed before as minor inconsistencies now lined up in a way that felt deliberate. The financial documents I had caught glimpses of, the sudden shift in my mother's tone whenever certain topics came up, the way conversations would redirect the moment I asked simple questions, and the more I thought about it, the more it became impossible to ignore. I had not just been excluded, I had been removed at a very specific moment. Timing is never accidental, I said quietly to myself, because it is not, especially in families where control and perception matter more than honesty. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small folder I had kept without much thought before, the one where I had stored copies of documents I had handled over the past year, utility bills, partial agreements, notes I had written down when things did not quite add up, and I spread them out on the small desk in the room, not with urgency, but with precision, scanning each page with the same focus I had used at work that morning, looking for connections rather than explanations, and it did not take long to see it. Names repeated in different contexts, amounts that did not align with what had been said out loud, timelines that overlapped in ways they should not have if everything had been transparent. "So that is it," I said under my breath, not surprised, just confirming what I already felt, because the pattern was clear enough now. Whatever decisions had been made in that house had not included me, but they had been influenced by the assumption that I would not question them, and when that assumption became uncertain, I became inconvenient. I leaned back in the chair, folding my hands loosely in front of me, and for the first time since everything started, I allowed myself a small, controlled exhale, not relief, but clarity, because understanding the structure of a situation changes how you respond to it, and in that moment, I stopped seeing myself as someone who had been pushed out and started seeing the situation for what it was, a miscalculation on their part. I did not know every detail yet, and I did not need to, because I already had enough to understand the direction, and direction is what matters when you are building something from the ground up. I gathered the papers carefully, placing them back into the folder in an order that made sense to me, not because I planned to use them immediately, but because I knew I would need them when the time came, and as I set the folder aside, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. I was not going to confront them, I was not going to call, I was not going to explain anything. Because the moment you reveal what you know too early, you give the other side time to adjust, and I had no intention of giving them that advantage. Instead, I would continue exactly as I had started, quietly, deliberately, building stability, gathering information, and allowing them to believe that removing me had solved their problem, because people who think they are in control make mistakes, and those mistakes reveal more than any direct confrontation ever could. As I turned off the light and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling in the dim glow from the window, one thought settled in with absolute certainty. They believed I was no longer part of their situation, but in reality, they had just removed the one variable they did not fully understand, and when that realization reached them, it would not be a conversation, it would be a consequence. The next morning began before the sun fully reached the narrow window, and I woke up without hesitation, not because I was rested, but because I had already decided the night before that hesitation was something I could no longer afford. I moved through the small room with quiet efficiency, folding what little I had, placing everything back into the same duffel bag that now felt less like a symbol of loss and more like a tool for movement. And before I left, I paused briefly at the desk where the folder sat, running my fingers lightly across its edge, not out of attachment, but as a reminder that what I had seen was real and that I was not imagining the pattern that had pushed me out. When I stepped outside, the the air carried that early morning stillness that makes everything feel slightly suspended, and I adjusted my jacket before starting the short walk back toward the print shop, keeping my pace steady, my focus forward, because the moment you start looking back too often, you slow down, and slowing down was not an option anymore. When I arrived, Mr. Callahan was already inside, moving through the routine of opening the shop, and he gave a small nod when he saw me, the kind that acknowledged consistency without needing to comment on it, and I returned it with the same calm respect. "Good morning, sir," because maintaining structure in small interactions builds trust faster than explanations ever could. The work that day was heavier, more shipments, tighter timelines, but I welcomed it, because effort grounded me. It kept my thoughts aligned with action instead of drifting into speculation, and as the hours passed, I began to notice something shift, not just in my own rhythm, but in how I was being observed, not closely, not critically, but with a growing recognition that I was not temporary, that I was someone who would show up, complete what needed to be done, and not create problems in the process. During a brief pause in the afternoon, Mr. Callahan stepped beside me again, his tone as measured as always. "You are settling in quickly," he said, not as praise, but as an observation, and I responded simply, "I intend to make myself useful," because usefulness, when chosen deliberately, becomes a form of independence rather than obligation. He gave a slight nod, then added, "Consistency matters more than speed here," and I met his gaze briefly, understood. Because I recognized that what he was offering was not just guidance, it was a framework, one that I could build on without relying on anything unstable. That evening, when I returned to the room above the garage, the quiet felt different, not empty, but controlled, and I sat down at the desk again, opening the folder with a clearer mind than the night before, this time not just reviewing, but organizing, placing each document into a sequence that told a story without needing explanation, dates aligning with decisions, numbers connecting to conversations that had once felt vague but now carried weight, and as I worked through it, one detail stood out more than the rest, a transfer that had been mentioned casually weeks ago, something my mother had dismissed as routine, but the timing of it no longer made sense when placed alongside everything else. "That was not routine," I said quietly, "because routine does not require secrecy, and secrecy always points to intention." I leaned back slightly, considering the implication, not emotionally, but strategically, because if that transfer was part of a larger plan, then my removal from the house was not just about control, it was about eliminating a variable that could question or disrupt what they were trying to finalize. I closed the folder carefully, not because I was finished, but because I had reached a point where more analysis would not add clarity, it would only repeat what I already understood, and repetition without action does not move anything forward. Instead, I shifted my focus to what came next, strengthening the position I had started to build, ensuring that my work remained consistent, that my living situation remained stable, and that I continued gathering information without drawing attention to the fact that I was doing so. "You do not correct a miscalculation by announcing it," I said to myself, because the moment you reveal awareness, the other side adjusts, and adjustment reduces the advantage you gain from understanding. As I turned off the light and lay back again, the same thought returned, but sharper now, more defined. They believed removing me would simplify their situation, that it would give them space to finalize whatever they had been preparing without interference, but what they had not considered was that distance does not remove awareness, it amplifies it, and in the quiet space they had pushed me into, I was no longer distracted by their expectations or their narrative. I was seeing everything exactly as it was, and when people build something based on the assumption that you will not notice, the moment you do notice becomes the point where everything begins to shift, whether they are ready for it or not. The days that followed did not blur together the way people expect after something disruptive happens. They sharpened, each one defined by routine, by intention, by the quiet discipline of building something that did not rely on permission, and I kept my focus narrow on purpose, arriving early, completing every task without being asked twice, leaving nothing unfinished, because consistency, when sustained long enough, stops being noticed as effort and starts being accepted as standard. By the end of the second week, I was no longer being given simple sorting or labeling. I was trusted with intake logs, shipment tracking, and small decisions that required accuracy rather than supervision. And when Mr. Callahan handed me a clipboard one afternoon and said, check these against the manifest and sign off if everything matches. I understood exactly what that meant. Not just more responsibility, but a quiet acknowledgement that I was no longer temporary. Yes, sir, I will make sure everything is correct, I replied, keeping my tone measured. Because trust is something you reinforce through action, not through reaction. Outside of work, the structure held just as steady. The room above the garage remained quiet, predictable, and more importantly, uninterrupted. And in that space, I continued reviewing the documents piece by piece, not rushing, not forcing connections that were not there, but allowing the pattern to become clearer with each pass, and what had started as a suspicion was now forming into something more defined. The transfer I had noticed earlier was not isolated, it was part of a sequence. Amounts moved at specific intervals, aligned with dates that matched conversations I had overheard without context at the time, and once those pieces connected, the implication was no longer subtle. They were consolidating, I said quietly, because that was the only explanation that fit. Consolidating funds, adjusting ownership positions, preparing for something that required control over every variable they could manage. I leaned forward slightly, tracing one of the dates with my finger, and added under my breath, and I was not part of that plan, not with resentment, but with precision, because the more clearly I defined their intention, the more accurately I could predict their next move. The third week began without any interruption, no calls, no messages, no attempts to reach out, and that silence confirmed something important. They believed the situation was stable, that removing me had achieved the outcome they needed. And when people believe they have resolved a problem, they stop monitoring it as closely, they shift their attention elsewhere. And that is when mistakes begin to surface. One evening, as I was organizing the documents again, my phone vibrated on the desk, and for a moment, I simply looked at it without moving, because the name on the screen was one I had not seen since the night I left, Mom, displayed clearly in the dim light, and I did not reach for it immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of control, because how you respond to the first contact defines everything that follows. It stopped after a few seconds, the screen going dark again, and I let the silence return without reacting. Because one call does not establish urgency, it tests availability, and I had no intention of confirming that I was available on their terms. A few minutes later, it rang again, the same name, the same tone, but this time there was a shift, not in the sound, but in the context, because repeated contact changes the meaning from casual to intentional, and I picked up the phone, not to answer, but to observe, letting it ring once more before it stopped again. So now it begins, I said quietly, placing the phone back down exactly where it had been, because timing is everything, and the timing of that call aligned too closely with the pattern I had already identified to be coincidence. Whatever they had been preparing, whatever they had been consolidating, it had reached a point where my absence was no longer convenient, and that meant one thing: something had changed on their side that required my presence or my involvement. Something they could not resolve without me. I leaned back in the chair, folding my hands calmly, and allowed myself a small, controlled exhale, not out of relief, but out of confirmation, because everything I had been observing, every detail I had carefully placed into context, was now beginning to move from theory into reality. I did not call back, I did not send a message, I did not acknowledge the attempt in any way, because responding too early would reduce the pressure they were beginning to feel. And pressure is what reveals truth faster than any direct question ever could. Instead, I turned my attention back to the documents, but this time with a different focus, not just understanding what they had done, but anticipating what they would need next, because the moment someone reaches out after removing you, it is never about reconciliation, it is about necessity, and whatever they needed from me, they were going to have to make that clear without me asking. Because I had already spent enough time adjusting to their expectations, and now it was their turn to adjust to mine, whether they realized it yet or not. The next call came early the following morning, not late, not hesitant, but deliberate, and that difference mattered because people who are unsure reach out at night, quietly, hoping not to be confronted, but people who are under pressure call during the day, when they expect a response. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, not to create tension, but to establish pace, because the moment you answer immediately, you give control back without realizing it. Hello, I said calmly, my voice even, without warmth but without hostility, and there was a brief silence on the other end, just long enough to reveal that whatever she had prepared to say, it had not accounted for me actually picking up. "Tige," my mother said, her tone controlled but tighter than I remembered, "where are you?" And I did not answer the question, not directly, because direct answers give away position, and position is leverage. "I am safe," I replied, measured, respectful, leaving no space for concern but also no detail to work with. And there was another pause, shorter this time, followed by a shift in her voice, less controlled, more urgent. "You left without taking everything you need," she said, and I almost smiled at that, not visibly, but internally, because that was not concern, that was positioning. "I took what was necessary," I answered, keeping my tone consistent, and then I added, "If there is something specific you would like to discuss, you can say it," because I had no intention of allowing the conversation to drift into vague territory where she could regain control through implication. She hesitated again, and this time I could hear it clearly, the slight change in breathing, the way her words did not come as smoothly as they used to. "There have been some developments," she said finally, choosing her phrasing carefully, "and it would be better if you came back so we can talk about them properly." And I let a few seconds pass before responding, not out of indecision, but to allow the weight of what she had just said to settle, because silence forces the other person to hear themselves more clearly. "I do not believe returning is necessary for a conversation," I replied, my voice steady. "You may explain what you need to over the phone." And that was when the shift happened, subtle, but undeniable. The point where control begins to slip. "This is not something that should be handled like this," she said, her tone tightening further. "It involves family matters that require your presence." And I leaned back slightly in my chair, my free hand resting loosely on the desk, because now it was clear, she was not calling out of concern, she was calling out of necessity, and necessity changes everything. "If it requires my presence," I said calmly, "then it also requires clarity." And I let that sit for a moment before continuing, "What exactly do you need from me?" And there it was, the question she had been trying to avoid, because answering it would reveal the imbalance she had not anticipated. The silence that followed was longer this time, long enough that I could hear faint background noise, papers shifting, a door closing somewhere behind her, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, less composed. "There are documents that need to be reviewed," she said, "and certain approvals that cannot be completed without you," and that confirmed everything. I glanced at the folder on the desk beside me, not because I needed to, but because the connection between what I had already seen and what she was now admitting was complete. And I responded without changing my tone, "Then you should have considered that before asking me to leave." And I did not raise my voice, I did not add emphasis, because calm statements carry more weight than emotional ones when the other side is already unstable. She exhaled sharply, a controlled sound that failed to hide the underlying tension. "This is not about that," she said quickly. "This is about resolving a situation that affects everyone." And I allowed a brief pause before answering, because timing matters more than volume. "It became about that the moment I was removed from it," I said, evenly, and then I added, "You made it clear I was not part of the decision, so it would be inconsistent to assume I am required for the outcome." And there was no immediate response, just silence again, but this time it felt different, heavier, because the dynamic had shifted completely. She was no longer directing the conversation, she was reacting to it. "Tige," she said finally, her voice losing some of its structure, "we need to handle this properly." And I closed my eyes for a brief second, not out of frustration, but to maintain clarity, because words like properly are often used when someone wants to regain control without explaining why. "Properly would have included transparency from the beginning," I replied, still calm, still measured. "If you would like my involvement, then you will need to explain the full situation." And I stopped there, deliberately, because the next move was hers, and in that moment, for the first time since she had locked that door, she had no immediate response, no prepared line, no controlled tone, just silence, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. Whatever they had been planning, whatever they had tried to finalize without me, it had reached a point where they could not move forward without my consent, and now, for the first time, they were the ones standing on the outside, waiting for me to decide whether to open the door. She did not hang up, and that told me more than anything she had said so far, because people who still believe they hold control end conversations when they are challenged, but people who are losing it stay, even in silence, hoping the other side will fill it for them. I kept my breathing steady, my posture unchanged, giving her nothing to react to except the absence of movement. And after a few seconds that stretched longer than either of us expected, she spoke again, this time without the same structure she had tried to maintain before. "There are legal timelines involved," she said, her words more direct now, less filtered, "and if we do not address this immediately, it could create complications that affect the entire family." And I let that settle for a moment, not because I needed time to understand it, but because I wanted her to hear exactly what she had just admitted. "Legal timelines," I repeated calmly, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and I could almost hear the shift on the other end, the realization that she had revealed more than she intended to. "Yes," she replied quickly, attempting to regain control of the narrative, "and this is why I am asking you to come back, so we can resolve it efficiently." And I leaned slightly forward, resting my elbow on the desk, my voice remaining even. "You are not asking," I said quietly, "you are requiring," and that distinction mattered, because it reframed the entire situation in a way she could not easily redirect. There was a sharp inhale on the other end, controlled but unmistakable, and then her tone changed again, less authoritative, more strained. "Tige, please," she said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else she had said so far, not because of the word itself, but because of how rarely she had ever used it in that way. I did not respond immediately, because the moment you react to that shift too quickly, you undo the pressure that caused it, and instead I let the silence extend just enough for her to recognize it. "If there are documents that require my approval," I said finally, "then you already understand that I am not obligated to provide it under the current circumstances." And I did not raise my voice, I did not add emphasis, because calm clarity carries more authority than any emotional reaction could. "This is not about obligation," she replied, but her voice did not hold the same certainty. "This is about protecting what belongs to the family." And that was the moment everything aligned completely, not just the documents, not just the timing, but the underlying intention. "What belongs to the family," I repeated softly, and then I added, "You mean what has been transferred, adjusted, and restructured without full disclosure." And there it was, the direct connection between what I had seen and what she was now trying to manage, and the silence that followed was no longer controlled, it was reactive. "You do not have the full picture," she said after a moment, her tone defensive now, and I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible pause before responding. "Then provide it," because if there was one thing I was no longer willing to accept, it was partial information presented as authority. There was movement on her end, a faint sound of something being set down, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, more deliberate. "Your signature is required to finalize the transfer of a property holding," she said, choosing her words carefully now, "and without it, the process cannot be completed." And I glanced again at the folder beside me, not out of surprise, but out of confirmation, because the pattern had led exactly to this point. "And you proceeded with all preliminary steps without informing me," I said evenly, not accusing, just stating what was already clear, and she did not deny it, not directly. "We made decisions based on what was necessary at the time," she replied, and that phrasing was familiar, the same controlled language she had always used to justify actions that excluded me. I let a brief silence pass before responding, "Because timing defines impact. You made decisions based on the assumption that I would not question them," I said calmly, and then I added, "That assumption is no longer valid." And there was no immediate reply, just the sound of her breathing, less controlled now, more uneven. "We cannot complete this without you," she said finally, and there it was, the full admission, not framed as authority, not disguised as concern, but stated plainly as a fact. I leaned back slightly, allowing myself a measured exhale, not out of relief, but out of clarity, because the balance had fully shifted. "Then you understand the position this creates," I replied, my voice steady, and then I continued, "If my involvement is necessary, then my terms will also be necessary," and I did not elaborate, I did not explain those terms, because stating them too early would reduce their impact. There was a pause, longer than any before, and when she spoke again, the difference was undeniable. "What do you want?" she asked, and for the first time since that door had closed, the question was not rhetorical, it was real, and I looked at the documents in front of me, at the structure I had rebuilt in less than 3 weeks, at the clarity I now held that I had never been given before, and I understood that this was not just about returning or refusing. this was about redefining the entire dynamic on my terms, and whatever came next would not resemble anything they had planned when they believed I was no longer part of the equation. What do I want? I repeated quietly, not as hesitation, but as precision, because that question, finally asked without control or assumption behind it, was the first honest point in the entire conversation, and I let a brief silence settle before answering, not to create tension, but to make sure what I said next would not be misinterpreted or dismissed. I want full transparency, I said calmly, my tone steady. Not selective explanations, not partial documents, and not decisions presented after they have already been made, and I paused just long enough for that to register before continuing. I also want every document that requires my signature sent to me directly, in full, before any further action is taken, and there was no emotion in my voice, no anger, because clarity does not need volume to be effective. On the other end, I could hear her processing it, the shift in breathing, the quiet movement that suggested she was no longer leading, but responding, and after a moment, she said, "That can be arranged," her tone careful now, controlled but no longer authoritative, and I nodded slightly to myself, even though she could not see it, because that was the first concession. In addition, I continued, keeping my voice even, any future decisions involving shared assets or legal obligations will include me from the beginning, not at the point of completion, and I did not soften that statement, because it was not a request, it was a condition, and there was another pause, longer this time, before she replied, "That may require adjustments," and I answered simply, "Then adjustments will need to be made, because the structure of this conversation had changed completely, and neither of us needed to pretend otherwise." For a moment, neither of us spoke, and the silence no longer felt uncertain, it felt defined, as if both sides understood exactly where the line had been drawn. "Tige," she said finally, her voice quieter now, less controlled, "coming back would make this easier," and I allowed myself a small, measured breath before responding, because that suggestion was not unexpected, but it was no longer relevant. "Returning is not necessary," I said calmly. "Everything that needs to be addressed can be handled from where I am," and I did not offer my location, I did not offer reassurance, because those details no longer belonged to her to manage. There was a faint sound on her end, something being set down, perhaps papers, perhaps something else, and when she spoke again, the difference was unmistakable. "We did not intend for this to become complicated," she said, choosing her words carefully, and I considered that for a moment before replying, not emotionally, but factually. It became complicated when decisions were made without full awareness of the variables involved, and I let that sit without elaboration, because explaining it further would only dilute the point. Another silence followed, but this time it felt final, not unresolved, but concluded in a way that neither of us had anticipated when the conversation began. "I will have the documents sent to you," she said eventually, her tone steady but subdued, and I responded, "I will review them when they arrive," because that was all that needed to be said. There was no apology, no attempt to revisit what had happened before, and I did not ask for one, because apologies without change do not alter outcomes, and I was no longer interested in words that did not carry structure behind them. "We will speak again soon," she added, and I replied simply, "If necessary," before ending the call, not abruptly, not dramatically, just with finality. I set the phone down on the desk and sat there for a moment, not replaying the conversation, not analyzing it, because everything that needed to be understood had already been made clear, and instead, I looked at the folder beside me, at the documents that had once felt like fragments and now formed a complete picture, and I realized something that had not been fully apparent until now. I had not lost anything when that door closed. I had been removed from a system that relied on my silence, and in that removal, I had gained something far more valuable than access. I had gained position. I stood up slowly, moving toward the window, the evening light casting a soft reflection across the glass. And for a moment I simply looked out at the quiet street below, not searching for anything, not expecting anything, just observing the stillness that now felt like something I owned rather than something imposed on me. "You made it clear I did not belong there," I said quietly, not as accusation, but as acknowledgement, because that statement, spoken in a different context before, now carried a completely different meaning, and I allowed a small pause before finishing the thought. "And now it is clear that I do not need to, because the difference between being excluded and choosing not to return is not just circumstance, It is control, and for the first time in this entire process, that control was entirely mine.